When a lot of us think about what farm life must be like, we probably only think about the good things, like working with our hands, with animals, not being tied down to an office chair, but there are pros and cons to all kinds of work. Farm work is tough and not for the faint of heart, but with that being said, probably more than a few of us would jump at the opportunity to work on a farm surrounded by puppies. Christine Lee and her two daughters, Lucy and Stacey, were three of those people. In the 1980s, Christine had just moved to Surrey with her girls to escape an abusive ex-husband, and the young family were looking for a fresh start. Adding a puppy to the mix just seemed like the right step on the long path to rebuilding their lives. So Christine took Lucy and Stacey out to the farm to pick up the new addition to the family. The girls got their puppy, but whilst they were out on the property, they also found something else, some lifelong friends. The farm was owned by a couple, John Lowe and his wife, Susan Wilson. But when Christine and her daughters showed up on the farm that day, they all became close friends. But this friendship was tested when Christine and the girls were stuck without a place to live. John and Sue opened their doors, letting Christine and her daughters move onto the farm with them and giving them a place to stay. Sue became like a second mother to the girls, and all three of them quickly learnt what they needed to do to keep the farm running. But it's difficult to say exactly what happens behind closed doors when you're not there to witness it for yourself. Rumours of an affair between John and Christine started circulating, despite the over 20-year age gap between them, and the fact that they were all living on the same property as his wife. This was perhaps more than obviously a recipe for disaster, and things came to blows. Deciding to stay with his wife Sue, John and Christine ended the relationship and parted ways. Christine and her girls decided to move away, officially closing that chapter of their lives. But despite the unusual setting for her childhood, Christine's daughter Stacey remembered it quite fondly. She later said, quote, "John was like a dad to me, and Sue was like a second mum. I love him because he could be incredibly kind. He could be incredibly funny. Yes, he hit us, but it was not like we hadn't experienced it before." She then explained that her biological father had been a, quote, violent monster, but that John was, quote, much nicer and kinder. That was why several years later, when Sue became incredibly unwell, Stacey moved back into the farm to help keep it running and help look after Sue. But things were different this time around. Stacey was now an adult, and she didn't always like what John said or did, and she wasn't afraid to voice her opinions about it either. As the building pressure of Sue's declining health loomed over the household, tensions between John and Stacey grew worse until they reached their peak. In the summer of 2013, things got incredibly heated when John pulled a shotgun on Stacey during an argument and threatened to kill her if she ever stepped foot on his farm property again. Stacey, more than understandably, fled the scene and immediately contacted the police, telling them everything that had happened. This sent the police down to the farmhouse to check on things there and to see if Stacey had been telling the truth. They confiscated almost 10 guns from John's property, all of them which he had licenses for, as he needed them for his business. But the police were then left trying to figure out if his actions justified having his firearm licenses revoked. Threatening to shoot someone would definitely be enough for the police to confiscate John's guns permanently, but the case quickly devolved into pinning one person's word against another. John denied threatening Stacey, and she didn't want him to face criminal charges, so she subsequently dropped her suit against him. After hearing this, the police then decided to return the guns to John, but that was a decision that would have dire consequences for everyone involved in this case. With no one left to help him run the farm, and with him being in his early 80s, Christine moved back onto the farm with John. She took charge of looking after the animals and looking after John and her other daughter, Lucy, who sometimes stayed over to help her mother look after them as well. That was until only a few months later, when the police received a frantic and harrowing call from the property. In the recording of the call, Lucy can be heard explaining that John had just shot Christine, and now he was coming for her, too. Quote, "I'm running for my life. He's just shot my mum, John Lowe. He's going to shoot me. I doubt if I'm going to be alive if I go back there." Despite being terrified of him, Lucy made the conscious decision to go back in and face the man who'd shot her mother. And that was where the police found her when they arrived on the farm just moments later. The prosecution at court described how the police walked into a, quote, "scene of carnage." Christine was found inside the main building of the farmhouse, dead from several close-range shotgun blasts, and then they found Lucy outside near the animal pens. Lucy had also been shot with a shotgun at close range, meaning that she was already gone, and there was nothing that the first responders could do to help her when they arrived at the scene. John Lowe was found on the property, and with Lucy's desperate call to the police, there were no doubts that he was the one responsible for their murders. He was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, but the things he would say in court and whilst in custody only continued to paint a much darker picture of the man he truly was. At court, he denied any responsibility, saying that the whole thing and Lucy and Christine's deaths had just been a, quote, "terrible accident." According to John, the 3 of them had gotten into an argument over some dogs that John said he needed to destroy, and the woman wanted to spare them. This argument had then escalated into a physical fight over a shotgun, which had then gone off and killed Christine. 4 puppies had also been found shot dead at the scene, adding some credibility to John's version of events, but that was about as believable as his statement became, and the prosecution had his own words to use against him. While he was being arrested, John explained to the arresting officers that this had all happened because of Christine and Lucy. He said, quote, "They're starving me to death. I have to beg them for money." Later, whilst in custody, he added, quote, "This must look terrible to outsiders, what's happened, but I assure you, nothing else could be done. I needed to put them down. A lot of things will go in my favour about how they acted, but you can't get past the fact I shot them. If they hadn't gone all fucking mental at me, I wouldn't have pulled the trigger." The prosecution read John's chilling statements, giving a totally different and unfiltered version of events right before they played the recording of Lucy's desperate call to the police. It became perfectly clear that John had simply been unhappy with Christine and Lucy being on his property and the way they were running his business, but instead of just asking them to leave, he decided to take matters into his own hands, with devastating consequences. John Lowe was found guilty of 2 counts of murder and weapons charges, landing him with a minimum 25-year sentence, but by this point, John was in his mid-80s. He died only a few years into his sentence, leaving Christine's surviving daughter, S.D.C, feeling like he never truly paid for his crimes against her mother and her sister. This case did, however, shine a spotlight onto the Surrey's police, particularly their firearms department, and an inquest was conducted to find out if the department had made the right decision to return the guns to John after Stacey had dropped her charges against him. From the outside looking in, especially after a double homicide has been committed, it could look like a rather clean-cut decision to say that the department had been at fault. But if they'd only been following protocols, that would mean that the police had played no part in the crimes that John had went on to commit. 2 separate investigations were held, both of them coming to the same result. The officers handling John's case and making that decision to return his guns to him were found to have not followed protocols correctly. The department as a whole were found to not meet the nation's standards, and 3 officers were fired as a result of the inquest's findings. This conclusion means 2 things: that the department were, at the very least, held accountable for the mistakes they made, but it also confirmed one very simple fact: that both Christine and Lucy's deaths were entirely preventable.